Welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So this is going to be the last video that I'm going to record for Chapter 7's content. So in the first video, we were looking at general layout basics, working with float and clear and overflow. And then in the second video, I was talking about working with different print styles. In this video, I'm going to show you some content from the book. I figured that the book does a pretty good job of illustrating, and they've got a couple of examples that require downloading more content, so I figured it would be better to just kind of show you. But I do have an example that we're going to do together, and that's going to be working with fragment identifiers. And that's going to be something that you are actually going to be required to have in your final project. So that's why I wanted to highlight it a little bit further. Now, in looking at Chapter 7's content, you can kind of get an idea for everything that we've covered. We talked about working with the flow of content, floating, clearing flows, using overflow. I talked about box sizing. They have some examples about working with basic two-column layouts. So this, I think, would be something that would be really good for you to go through on your own, where they have some examples with working with the nav on the left. A lot of it's just controlling the size that something is, so that way if the navigation can only take up so much space, then the main is going to kind of fill in next to it, and then they just add in some margin to account for that space. So if that's something that you're kind of interested in, that could potentially be helpful when you are getting to a point of working on your final. They also then have vertical navigation. Now, we've already looked at the horizontal navigation with an unordered list. This is basically doing the same thing, only it's not adding in the step of changing the display to be inline. It's keeping the display as a block. And they have some examples where you have the navigation on the left, in addition to actually going in and building the navigation as this column that has its own color and everything. So I think these examples here with this lighthouse example would be good to look at. And then they go into detail on working with pseudo classes, which is something that we already looked at in the video from last week. So if you want to try to keep things as much in order as possible, you could go and you could review the video that talked about navigation UL, and pseudo classes and keep that all together. But you should be fine, even though we looked at it ahead of time. And then you'll notice there's a couple more practices working with all of these. Next, I have some information about printing, some tips and everything, and that should tie in pretty well. Now, there's some stuff that I'm not going over. So there's this CSS sprites. And again, I try to keep my demonstration simple, where you don't have to download anything, and instead you can download from your files to get access to this. But they've got this example where they're using these little sprites and they're including it in the navigation, so that way it shows up when you're clicking on the navigation, kind of hovering over it. So this could be something that you might find useful. They're using background image to bring in the sprite, and they're also making it so it doesn't repeat. They're kind of controlling the position of where that shows up. And then this actually gets us into our first topic. And this is one where, again, I'm not going to have us do an example, but I think it's definitely worth checking out, because it's something that more than likely you might be interested in using for your projects, for your final, and then if not now, sometime in the future. So you can actually control the position of something using the position property. And let me resize that so it's out of the way. So the position property configures the type of positioning used when the browser renders an element. And we've got static is the default value. The element is rendered in normal flow. So if you've noticed, like with your footer, where your footer is always just going to kind of fill in with the regular flow of everything else. If you don't have enough content to fill the page, your footer is going to move with everything else, and it's going to be like halfway down the page. So if you've ever wanted to have your footer not do that, you might be interested in some of these other values. So fixed configures the location of an element within the browser's viewport. The element does not move when the page is scrolled, so it stays fixed in that position. Relative configures the location of an element relative to where it would otherwise render in normal flow. Sticky combines features of relative and fixed positioning. It's not supported in Internet Explorer. And then absolute precisely configures the location of an element outside of normal flow. And there's a couple of examples here. This one I think is pretty cool. It's showing that with the fixed positioning, you could have the navigation, like in this case on a left nav, where it can stay scrolled in place, and so the rest of the page could scroll and that would stay in the same position. Now that's fine because what's happening here is it's on the left, and so you never have to worry about it overlapping any of your other content. But you might be wondering, well, what do I do if I want it to be going all the way across the top? And what if I have some other content that could end up overlapping with it? And that's where they have some other examples. Here they have some information on relative positioning. So use relative positioning to change the location of an element slightly relative to where it would otherwise appear. However, the area in normal flow is still reserved for the element, and other elements will flow around that reserved space. And they have information about position relative, and then saying left, right, top, or bottom. And there's some examples of what these look like. These are the sort of thing where I think that by actually going through and working with these yourself, you're going to get a better idea of how they actually work and how they're different from each other. All right, so Z-index, this is going to be what's going to be really helpful if you want to have a horizontal navigation that stays in place, but you have other information that basically scrolls behind it. So the Z-index property, I'll just read it here. Z-index property provides a way to configure the stacking of positioned elements on a web page. Basically, it allows some things to come closer to us, or at least seem like they're coming closer to us. So they are closer to us on the screen, and then some things will be further away. So they can essentially block the other ones from view. So if you are familiar at all, like we've talked about the x-axis, the y-axis. So the y-axis is going up and down, x-axis is going left or right. So z-index is depth. It's going towards us and away from us. So that's why it says z-index, is it's that z-axis. Okay, so by default, we have everything is going to be set to 0. So if we set numbers to this, then we can have, we can control how far away things are from us. And let's see if we have an example. So here they have an example where they have a hero image and they have the position relative. And then what they're doing is they're creating the H1, so the text that's going to go over top of the image. They are having it be positioned absolutely. It's going to be from the top, it's going to be 40%, left 10%, width 40%. And then they have a z-index. And a lot of times you'll see this where technically you could just say 1. If the other items by default are all 0, you could just put 1, and as long as the number is bigger than 0, it's going to come towards you. But a lot of times what people do is they go for this absolute range where they want the number to be as large as possible, so they go for 999 instead. So you'll see that a lot in these examples. So what's happening here is we got this H1, and it's closer to us than the background image. So not only is it acting like more of a background image where it's behind things, and we would have to see if this is actually, I would assume, it's been a while since I've looked at this, I would assume this is just a regular image and it's not being used as a background image on like a div or anything, but we can still layer things over top of the image by using this z-index. So it's pretty handy. So everything else by default would have 0, and so just by putting the number on the thing that you want to be closer, that's going to allow it to go over top of everything, and then everything else will just scroll behind it. Here they have a really nice example where they're doing the same thing but with a navigation bar. This would be a really good example if you are interested in doing this for your final project. I've got just this real simple navigation where there's home, menu, directions, contact. Here you have the information. So the navigation is going to use the fixed position, and they're saying that it's going to start at the top in the left. They're giving it a particular height, and then it's just going to span all the way across. So it's going to be 100%. And then they're using a really big number to make sure that's always going to be in front. And then anything else by default is just going to fall in behind it. And then they're just using some basic things like the list style type none, text aligned to the right, font size, margin. So none of that's really unique. That's just kind of their basic styles that they're wanting to do. In the case here, header, we've got the background color, text color, font size, padding, background image, background repeat, margin top. That's just making sure that it's saying, well, we need 40 pixels above this to be empty. And so it's giving some space for that 40 pixels of the height of the nav. And then what's going to happen is basically as you scroll, it's just always going to have that bar at the top. And you could do that with your footer too. You would do the reverse with the positioning, but you would still use the fixed, and it would allow your footer to stay in place. All right, so the example that I want us to do is going to be working with fragment identifiers. And this is more of a concept where there's going to be two components to it, and it's going to work with your HTML. You're going to have your ID and you're going to have a link. But this is the sort of thing where if you try to look up this concept, like if you try to just Google fragment identifier, you may or may not find information because it could go by a different name. But you're basically working with an item, an HTML element, and you're adding an ID to it. So you can think of it this idea of it's a fragment, it's a piece that you are trying to identify and then link to. And it says here, sometimes called fragment or fragment ID. And you'll often see this with content where you have a lot of things on the page. And FAQ is a really good example because you could have a list of different things that you might want to potentially go to. And it's just, so you would want to jump down further to the page. So that's what we're going to create. And I still have the examples here from the last example. So let me close those. And then I'm going to create new file. We're going to save as. And I'm going to save this as favorites. I'll just save this to week 5. We want to make sure that this is going to be in HTML. For the title, I'm going to call this My Favorites. Now, for this one, we don't need to worry about styles. We're just going to be focusing on the HTML. And let's start with an H1, and we'll just say My Favorites. And then we're going to create a list of things that are our favorites. So I'm going to create this as an unordered list. And this can be anything. I'm going to give you a couple of examples that you can kind of use to start off with, but it's kind of up to you what you might want to do. So like a lot of times I'll do like favorite music, for example. You could have like favorite sports, could be whoops, favorite food, favorite animals. That's actually where the animals example came from, because I used to have these combined in the same lecture. Let's do favorite, I don't know, cars. You can really pick whatever you want. Movies, books, video games, hobbies, you know, whatever. It could even be like favorite places that you like to like go on vacation, like favorite countries, favorite languages, just whatever you might want to favorite. So we have our list, and then we're going to go and create an H2 for each of these. So favorite music, all right, so we've got our categories, and then under each one of these, I am going to have a list, but these are going to be ranked because they're, well, it's up to you. You can choose if you want to rank them or if you don't want to. If you wanted to rank them, you could think of like, this is my absolute favorite, this is my second favorite. So you could do rankings like with an ordered list. Or you could do an unordered list, and it could just be your general 5 favorites. So you would create these. I'm going to do this pretty quick so you can get a general idea of how it works. But I do think it would be beneficial if you actually worked all of it out. So let's do, I'm going to copy this. So we've got favorite music, and then now I could switch this and I could just type in sports. Whoops. I guess I accidentally removed the numbers. I guess this doesn't really make sense. Plural animals. Should be animal, but I'll be fine. All right, so now we've got all of our kind of key content that we'd want to jump to. Let me actually save this and open it. So now we have enough content that it can't all fit on one page. It's still a managed, like it's not too much of a scroll. We would get a better idea for what this looks like and how it behaves if I actually didn't have it take up the whole screen. So some things that you can do, because the fragment identifier is really great if you have a long list of things, but it's also really great if you want to have a back to top button that will take you back to the top of your navigation. That's really handy if you have mobile. So what you could also do is you could have a link here. And I'm going to kind of hold off on the link, but you could say back to top. Let me save that. So you could have this back to top button, and it would help take you back to the top. So the two pieces you need for your fragment identifier is you need a link to an ID, and then you need the ID itself. So what I'm going to have us do is each of these H2s is going to have an ID. Whoops. So for example, this one will be music. And if you chose different categories, just choose IDs that are going to make sense. So I got music, I got sports, got food, animals, and then cars. And then what I can do for the one that's going to match here, since going back to top, I'm going to make our my favorites. This is going to be our top. And I'm just going to call it top. So the way that you link to an ID is you put a link and then you can say the ID. So I can just say I want to link to the top. Or you can also put in the name of the file. So let's say that you wanted to jump to a section that was on a different page. You would need to specify the name of that file. So in this case, since this is called favorites, I could say favorites.html, and then I could put $ top, and so it would go to the top ID that's on the favorites page. So this would be definitely essential if you were linking to something on a different page, but it also doesn't hurt to put the name of the file as well. But you should be able to also just use the name of the ID and have it link to that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this favorites.html and then top, and then we would do the same thing for each of these. Let me just do it this other way. So we've got, it'll go to, oh wait, sorry, I brought this backwards. These will be this way, and then what I was going to do is I was going to make these all links. So each of these would have and I just have to make sure that my text ends up in the right place. So we have the link is inside of the LI. And what might be easier to do here is just copy this and then swap it and then just kind of double check. So I've got sports, I've got food, animals, cars, and then I could go ahead and delete these. I was just using those as kind of reference. So let me save that. Okay, so I've got top. So anything that links to the ID top will go up. These will link down to the ID. So music will link here, sports, food, animals. And you just want to double check that your names match. And then I've got this link here, favorites.html.top. Just for variety, to show you can do it a couple ways. So now I should be able to refresh this. And if I click on music, it jumps me down to the music section. If I click on sports, it'll move me down to sports, food, move me down to food, animals, and then cars. And then I could do back to top. Now what could be handy is, and I've had some students do this for the final project, is they took this back to top and they put it inside of like a little div, and they used the fixed position so that that div would just kind of stay somewhere on the page, maybe maybe it was like on the right, so it wasn't taking up a lot of space, but it would actually move along the flow of everything. So that way, if you needed to go back to the top and you were somewhere in the middle, it still would show up. And that's something that you could consider having, rather than having it be all the way at the bottom. But that's something that I would recommend for your final project, just in case you don't have a page that has a whole lot of content to scroll, would just be using a back to top to help fulfill that requirement. And that'll be pretty handy. Or you could try to have that button and have it actually flow along with the content in conjunction with that idea of working with the position property. All right, so the only real thing left with this is if you want to fill this out, you can. I think it's kind of fun. What I used to do back when I was teaching the 4th edition of the book, because they actually introduced this at the same time as the figure and working with animals and everything, I used to have people find pictures to also include, because that also kind of helped fill up the length of the example. So not only were people having to kind of fill in their answers to everything, they could actually practice putting some pictures in here, and I thought that was kind of fun. But really, this is the key gist of everything, is just knowing how to work with the IDs and use this to link. And one last thing I wanted to show about this is, I think your book might actually have an example of a one-page website, because that's another reason why you might be interested in using this, is to just create a single page website that jumps you to different sections of the page. I feel like I've seen this a lot with websites that are for kind of smaller events, where it feels a little bit more like a brochure. And your textbook has a good example of this on page 254. You'll see it says single page website, and they have this structure here that says there's going to be a fixed navigation at the top, there's going to be a home page, there's going to be a tours page, there's going to be a hero image, rentals page, hero image, contact page, hero image, and then a bottom fixed footer. So it's really great practice with the fixed navigation and the fixed footer. And then all these pages are really just sections, essentially, where you're jumping down to different areas, and they give you kind of a preview of what all these look like, but it would all be on one single page, and it's just using the pictures to help break up the focus of everything. And then you would link here, like it shows the ID for home, the ID for tours, the ID for rentals, and then contact. And then so long as you have things named with those IDs, it would jump you down to those sections. So that would be a good one to try out, but it would just require that you go and download the images to go along with that example. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the discussion or send me an email.